Our first example of religion and ethics is our good dead friend, St. Thomas Aquinas. A little background for Thomas. He was born in 1224 or 1225 into a noble Italian family. At the end of his life, a few months before he died, he had what could be considered like a great thing or a terrible thing, depending on how you look at it. He had a mystic experience that caused him to stop writing. And the quotable quote for him, translated in English, of course, is, "I can write no more. I have seen things which make all my writings like straw." On one hand, great that he had a mystical experience. On the other hand, given the amount of writing he did, it would be in a way kind of bad to have all your writings, your life's work, turned into essentially just straw, worthless. He ended up dying in 1274 en route to the Council of Lyons. And then in 1323, he was canonized, which is becoming a saint. And one of the downsides of sainthood as a job is you have to be dead. So if someone asks you if you to apply for sainthood, keep in mind that death is a job requirement, at least currently. And then in 1879, Pope Leo XIII recommended his philosophy as a model for Catholic thought, and he had an influence not only on Christian thought in particular, but philosophy in general. Now, getting back to his earlier backstory, like some philosophers, he had a nickname, and his was the Ox, because he was large and quite rotund, but gentle. And his fellow students sometimes referred to him as the Dumb Ox, because he was quiet in class and did not engage in the discussions. Now, there's a story, supposedly about Aquinas, about a cow, which is this. To kind of tease him and make fun of him, some other monks told him that a cow was flying apparently over the monastery, and he went to look. And they laughed at him and said, Thomas, do you really think cows could fly?" And he replied back, a very clever response, that he would rather believe that a cow could fly than another monk would lie to him, which is quite a burn. He wrote a lot, 25 volumes, and according to some stories, there were 4 secretaries, constantly working to transcribe his writings. His best-known work, the biggest one, is the Summa Theologica, and this is longer than Aristotle's works, so a very prolific writer. And again, it's either great or sad that he had that mystic experience that caused him to look at all his life's work as essentially, worthless. So, in terms of his moral philosophy, categorizing it, he embraces a form of teleological ethics, that is to say that it's purpose-based. And putting him in the category we looked at in terms of intellectualism versus voluntarism, he's pretty clearly in the intellectualist camp. So definitely a believer in God, but he regards morality as something that is not simply what God arbitrarily wills. Now, his major influence, other than Catholicism, was our good dead friend Aristotle. He was influenced by Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and essentially you could think of his work as a Christian mod of Aristotle's ethics, much like how people, mod video games or modify cars. He took Aristotle's pagan ethics and then, Christianized it. Or another way to look at it is he took the Aristotle's, cake of morality, and then put another layer on top, a angel food cake, as one will. So, very much like Aristotle, he believed in a teleological universe. The main difference, of course, is whereas Aristotle, was a pagan, did not believe in the Christian God, monotheism, etc., Aquinas obviously did. But, like Aristotle, he believed that everything that occurs because it's directed towards an end, a goal or a purpose. And we humans have ends and purposes, and also, of course, inclinations. And our special ability as earthly beings, according to him, is that we're the only beings here on Earth that can consciously choose to act towards our ends and inclinations. We have free choice, unlike animals, etc. And so for him, ethics, at least ethics here, deals with determining what ends and goals are worthy of our pursuit and which ones are not. And taking it from Aristotle, he regards moral good, at least here in this world, more on that later, is fulfilling our natural end as humans. So essentially his base ethics, for life on Earth, essentially Aristotle's virtue theory. In terms of actions that we can take, he takes a view that may seem somewhat unusual, that any action that's genuine is either good or bad. Nothing you do that's a genuine action is morally neutral, which may seem weird, but that's what he claims. This is because you may wonder, how could this be? If I, the way I put the toilet paper roll, on the dispenser, paper up or paper on the bottom, the sheet coming off from it, how could that be, good or evil? Wouldn't that be neutral? Well, his reasoning is this. Every action that you choose, a genuine action, you make a choice, he claims you're always seeking an end. You have a goal that's being aimed for. And this end, this goal, will either be good or bad. So no chosen action is morally neutral. Every action would be aimed towards something ultimately good or bad. As I mentioned before, he's an intellectualist, so he believes the intellect is primary in ethics, and only actions that are chosen and deliberate have moral qualities. And this is a view this one's pretty common. Intuitively, we tend to think that if something occurs entirely by accident and you didn't choose to do it, then you're not to be, condemned or praised. It's simply, accidental. But if you choose to do something, then it can have moral qualities. And that part seems, sensible. So for him, the will automatically desires what is good. So much like people like Aristotle and other thinkers, we will the good, but then the problem we run into is knowing the good. So we're good seekers, but we could choose, poorly. We could, out of ignorance, as we'll see in the future, how he thinks evil comes about. So we need reason to determine what is good and how to do it. So on his view, we do want good, but we need to know what is good and how to get good. So he also distinguishes between, and this will seem like maybe a fine, maybe pointless distinction, but between human actions versus acts of humans. And it's an important distinction. So human actions are voluntary, consciously willed actions that we choose because we are seeking a particular end. We're consciously choosing it to do something. And given what I said about him before, any action that's a human action that we take will either be good or bad. So human actions are consciously willed actions that have a purpose to them. And again, for him, there are no morally neutral actions. So the way you put the toilet paper roll on the dispenser, that's a conscious choice and would be good or bad. How you brush your teeth, would also be good or bad, because those are the things you'd consciously choose. Now, what about other stuff? Well, other stuff we do, he calls acts of humans. And these are things we do unconsciously or involuntary. So obvious examples would be, bodily functions we're not in control of. So sneezing, for example, would be an act of human. And these can be morally neutral because we don't choose them. They just happen. I mean, they might end up having what we might see as like a bad consequence. A person may be driving and suddenly they sneezed, despite trying to resist it, and they, their eyes close and they crash into somebody. And we might say that ended up being bad, but their action in itself, the sneezing, would not be immoral because they couldn't control that. So how do we assess morality for Aquinas? What do we look at? Well, he borrows again, heavily from Aristotle. So the first thing we'd consider is the object of the action. What is it that it is doing? Secondly, he asks us to look at the circumstances of the action, and finally, the end of the action. Not end like in the sense of like when it completes, like action over, but the goal or purpose. And to illustrate his view, he gives the example of giving alms, which is, giving money. Now, the object of giving alms is to give money to someone who is in need. So that's the first part, the object. The second would be the circumstances. And in the case of giving money, that would include such things as where did the money come from? Like, was it earned honestly? Was it, Robin Hooded? Was it stolen? Etc. And also things like the needs of the recipient. Giving money to someone who's incredibly well off really would be different from giving money to someone who's in desperate need. And the final thing would be the end of the action. Again, not like the action is over, but in the sense of its goal or purpose. And this could include such things as laudable goals, such as helping someone in need, or less so, which would be to be simply praised for being generous, or even less so, simply to give money to charity to get a break on one's taxes. And so for Aquinas, any action that we choose to do would be subject to assessment on those grounds. Now he ends up, as I noted earlier, doing a Christian modification of Aristotle's ethics. And of course, he does this because Aristotle doesn't have, Christian ethics. Although there are some that would debate that. There was, or maybe still is, a view, somewhat popular during the Middle Ages, that Plato and Aristotle were, in the phrase of some, Christians before Christ. That they held views that they dimly recognized, monotheism, etc. And there are some arguments for that. Plato's good, Aristotle's theory, etc. But if you read the text, Aristotle does place humans in a special role. Like we saw when we talked about virtue theory, humans are rational beings. That's our special deal. And if the question arises in Aristotle's written works that we have, what role does God play in them? The answer is none whatsoever. He doesn't mention, the monotheistic God. So what Aquinas ends up doing, as I mentioned before, he essentially mods Aristotle's non-Christian ethics. So Aquinas agreed that Aristotle gave us a really good natural ethical theory. And this is good for the imperfect natural world. Basically, it's a good ethics for life here and now. But, he claims, we need more. And here's Aquinas' gist of his argument. Aquinas claims that nature doesn't give us the means for satisfying our spiritual nature. Although it does provide us with the means for satisfying like our natural desires, but we have a spiritual desire beyond nature. And not surprisingly, the supreme good can only be found in God, not here in the imperfect world, but only in the perfect God. So how do we acquire this supreme good? Well, it's not merely knowing about God intellectually, like doing, philosophy or theology and knowing about God, but, according to Aquinas, by actual acquaintance with God, hanging out with him. And given his view, you can only meet God when you're dead. And so he makes kind of an interesting argument that since we desire ultimate happiness, this ultimate happiness requires being acquainted with God. You can only be acquainted with God when you're dead, but of course you can only be happy if you still exist. So one must conclude there must be an afterlife. It's an interesting argument, which later gets criticized by many philosophers, including our good dead friend David Hume. But interesting argument in any case. So Aquinas is considered to be a natural law theorist, which is a fairly important conception in ethics, has a lot of implications. So he brings in God obviously for this part of natural law, and here's how power works. He believed that humans were created by God with a purpose to live a certain way. And because of this, given that he's an intellectualist, he believes you could reflect with reason on human nature and study essentially what we are to reveal guidelines for actualizing our potentials to fully become our best selves. Now, one of the general questions in ethics is, as we saw, is ethics something objective, something relative, etc.? And Aquinas is definitely on the objective side because, one thing obviously is he is God setting the, kind of setting up the universe, but also he believed that human nature is the same across cultures and time. So even though humans do vary, and he was aware that humans varied in culture and belief and so forth, but he had the view that humans are essentially human, that underneath all our differences in culture and time and locations and so forth, humanity is fundamentally similar. And because of this, he inferred that the rules of the natural law are both universal, they apply to everyone, and he claimed they're self-evident. Now, self-evidence for him doesn't mean that it's easy to understand or automatic. One way you could look at self-evident is just obvious, but he doesn't mean that. Something for him, as we'll see, could be self-evident, but it could be very difficult to get to the point where you realize that it's self-evident. And so to the obvious objection, but if this is true, that it's self-evident, why doesn't everyone just agree on ethics? And his answer essentially is it's not something you just automatically see. You have to, requires a pretty deep understanding. To use an analogy, it's kind of like mathematics. Mathematics is hard, but the people who are really good at it, once they do all that stuff, they realize that the mathematical truths are self-evident. So he believes what is good is what is in accord with reason, because reason will reveal to us the natural law, and if we're doing the right thing and being all we can be, or rather what we should be, we'll conform to this natural law. And he believed that if you reflect on human nature and our natural inclinations, you could infer moral principles. So his view was you could know about ethics by reason. So this again is why he's in the intellectualist camp. So natural morality. And this is his view that as natural beings living here in an imperfect world, there is a morality that governs us in the here and now. And what he does is he takes kind of an empirical approach. You look at how humans or other creatures behave, and then draw inferences about how they should behave. So, for example, he notes that all creatures seem to naturally try to preserve their own life. If you try to kill them, they'll try to kill you right. So from this, he infers that murder and suicide is wrong, and thus, or rather because life is to be preserved. And he's making an inference from how things behave. Again, you try to kill something, it tries to kill you right back or tries to escape. Therefore, he infers life is to be preserved because that's how things behave. Another example, he claims that all animals seek to preserve their species and protect their young. For us humans, a little more complicated. This involves not just protecting our children, but also helping them develop their full potential, which I guess this also includes other animals as well. Now, Aquinas takes the view that humans are above animals. As we'll see when we talk about animals and ethics, he makes the argument essentially that humans are above animals, so we can eat animals. Animals are above plants, so they can eat plants. And because we're above animals and we're rational, he believes that we're inclined to develop our rational human potential. And this, for him, entails that we have a duty to seek truth and to follow the rules needed to live in society. This, of course, would have interesting implications for today. The view that we need to seek truth, and we need to follow rules that are needed for us to be able to survive in society. And so today, it'd be interesting to see Aquinas' view on events of today. Now, given that he assumes, or rather argues, that there's a natural morality and there is a human nature that's the same across all cultures and time, how does he explain moral disagreement? Because it is evident, and people who argue for moral relativism, and also for subjectivism, and also for moral nihilism, argue that if you look at the world, you'll see that people have very different morality. And even if the same country, even the same state, even the same family, you can have people with very different moral views. And given his view about ethics, they can't all be right. So how can people, disagree? How are at least some people wrong? Well, what he claims is this. People are imperfect. So some people are blinded by their passions. Some are affected by, bad habits they've accumulated that cause them to, get the natural law wrong. And of course, ignorance. Again, he believes the natural law is self-evident, but that doesn't mean that it's easy. It means that once you fully understand it, you would say, aha, that's just, self-evident. It's evidently true. And so ignorance, he believes, is a factor. So people who don't get the natural law fail because of imperfection, because humans are imperfect beings with limits and defects, and so we don't always get things right. So he doesn't use this analogy, but you could use an analogy to math. If a bunch of people, like in a class, try to solve a really difficult math problem, and people get different answers, you wouldn't infer that there is no correct answer. You'd infer that at least some of them had to be wrong. Maybe all of them got it wrong for similar reasons. They're not doing the math correctly. Now, he's also very interested in the conscience, and takes the view that the conscience that we have is this. Now, we often think of the conscience as something like a little voice that tells us what to do or not do, to serve as our guide. But he regards the conscience as a rational activity that involves taking our moral knowledge and applying it to specific cases. So it's less like having, the model of like having a little angel sitting on your shoulder, kind of whispering to you, hey, don't do that. It's more that you engage in an analysis of the situation, applying your moral knowledge, and then, kind of like our ethics case paper, and making a decision. Now, he takes the view that every will, to quote him, translated in English, of course, that every will at variance with reason, whether right or erring, is always evil. So even if a person gets it right, if they're not acting in accord with reason, they're actually wrong. And so he thinks reason is incredibly important. Again, this is no doubt the influence of Aristotle. But are people perfect? Well, no. So how do we, as he himself noted, so how do we address this imperfection? Well, he believes that we're obligated to follow our informed conscience as well as possible. In other words, we're not perfect, but we're obligated to do the best we can. And for him, this includes, he makes, the note of the informed conscience. So it's, a person doesn't get an excuse because they're, say, willfully ignorant and, just do what they do and never bother to, criticize their own beliefs or investigate them. It has to be an informed conscience. So if a person, is done their homework, so to speak, and acts in accord with their informed conscience as well as possible, then they could still, get it wrong, but he believes they should be judged based on how well they did in their judgment. So even if a person is mistaken, he holds a view that one should be judged by how well they followed the moral light as they saw it, again, given their informed conscience. So you would take into account was the person acting in good faith? Did they, so to speak, do their homework to make a good decision? And if they did fail, then the judgment would be, would take that into account. They did the best they could, given what they knew, and they worked at not being ignorant. Now, if someone just simply engages in willful ignorance, then then they would be judged on that. Now, we talked briefly about the natural law, and Aquinas ends up having a total of 4 categories of laws: the eternal law, the natural law, divine law, and last and least, human law. So this brings in metaphysics. And metaphysics in philosophy is the study of the nature and structure of reality, assuming it has a nature and structure. It's the ultimate reality. So, as Aquinas sees it, God has this eternal law, and we'll talk about that in a bit. And this eternal law creates the moral law in our nature. It expresses it. To use kind of a rough analogy, it's kind of like, a DNA thing, where you'd have like the DNA code, and then of course we instantiate that code. Now, being intellectualist, Aquinas does not consider the moral law an arbitrary creation of God's will. So how does God create his eternal law? Well, what Aquinas seems to think is that God reasons it through, and of course God is perfect and all-knowing, so he gets it right, and he uses his reason, grounded in his nature. God is not arbitrary, at least on Aquinas' view, and so the moral law is also not arbitrary, so he reasons it out perfectly. And for Aquinas, as I noted, there are 4 ways in which this law of God is manifested. The first is the eternal law. This is the rational order that God established for the world he created. And everything follows this law. Now, non-rational beings simply follow the law. And this would include, put in kind of modern terms, laws of physics and chemistry and so forth. So objects just follow the law. They don't, break the laws of physics. Now, humans as physical beings, of course, we also would obey the laws of physics, chemistry, biology, etc. But when it comes to the moral aspects of the law, we get this interesting ability to obey or disobey these aspects. So for Aquinas, morality is a law, but unlike the laws of physics and so forth, we can choose to obey or disobey the moral laws, which is attempt to answer the question, how, if God is all good, all powerful, all knowing, and makes all the rules, how is it that humans don't just follow the moral laws? How are we evil? And kind of the free will response is, we're free to choose this. And so even though the moral laws are the law, unlike the laws of physics, we can choose to disobey them. Next is the natural law. And this is law that's available to our reason. We can understand at least some of it, and it's what regulates our human moral behavior. This is the law for the here and now. And this is, on his view, the law that guides us in our role as natural beings and social beings. Essentially, he just borrows Aristotle's stuff here. And so, essentially, it's the virtue theory, where what you're supposed to do here is develop the classic virtues such as temperance, courage, and justice. So the natural law essentially is Aristotle's moral theory. And then he adds on the divine law, which is something Aristotle didn't have. So this is sort of the major Christian modification of Aristotle's moral theory. Or you could look at it as like a cake. You've got the Aristotle cake, and then Aquinas, says, I can improve this, and puts a divine layer on top of it. Now, the divine law is not something you get by reason. You get it by revelation. And this, for Aquinas, goes beyond the natural law. And its function is this. It's not for guiding us, here and now in our role as natural and social beings. It's for guiding us towards eternal happiness. And when we follow this law, the natural virtues, things like temperance, courage, and justice, basically Aristotle's ethics, these are exceeded by theological virtues, and these are faith, hope, and love. Now, these virtues for him are special. In the case of our natural virtues, we would get them, as Aristotle discussed them. If you wanted to be courageous, you do brave things until you became brave. In the case of the theological virtues, you can't get these virtues by just like doing stuff. They can only be attained by God's grace. And so this is where the divine, religious, supernatural part comes in, where you have these virtues that transcend the natural world and are dispensed by God. And interestingly, Aristotle did talk about virtues being dispensed not by God, because predates monotheism, at least Western monotheism, but the notion that the gods would dispense out virtue. Now, the final law, and least of all, would be the human law. And these are laws created by us humans. And he takes the view that in our law, the laws we make up, the only thing that's just and lawful in them is what we've drawn from the eternal law. So what in a way would make a human law good, just and lawful, is that we've modeled it on God's laws. Now, of course, this becomes an interesting point of debate and discussion in the context of ethics, politics, and religion, because, as I mentioned, when we were talking about mixing norms between religion, say, and ethics, religion, and law, there are those who take the view that you should build human law based on religion, based on God's law. And of course, there are very different ways to conceive this. So Aquinas, of course, has a very philosophical view, which is that God creates this rational order for the created world. It's an eternal law, and we should strive to make our laws just and lawful based on these objective moral principles. Now, another view is that a person may just turn to their religious views and say, this should be law. What I believe based on my religion, or what I think is based on my religion, should just be made into law. And there are, of course, different ways to look at this. One view is, again, that there is an objective underlying moral principle that you should seek out through reason and learn to craft laws to that. And sort of another view is simply, I'll just take what I think is true and try to get that imposed on the law. And in both cases, of course, there's still the question of, is this, is it a rational step to go from religion to morality? And Aquinas, in a way, does the work there, because he does, lay out arguments for there being an eternal law and argues, as to why it's good, and then makes a reasonable case as to why our human laws should follow that objective moral order. So those are the four laws, the metaphysics, the eternal law, and of course the natural law, divine law, and human law.